you have a story. Speaker, host, and entrepreneur, Danny J. Johnson shares the bombshell that rocked her world.
Everything I thought about myself, all of the, ideas of who I was and who my family was gone in an instant.
The day that derailed the life she loved.
My doctor, I remember, she just says, "You're not going to perform again. We're not sure if you're going to walk again, and you're lucky to be alive."
And the biggest turning point in her unbelievable journey to find herself.
That moment was the moment of me getting out of my pity party and going, wait a second, this is not okay.
On an all-new Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. Welcome to Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers, a podcast dedicated to those seeking a more fulfilled and purposeful life through thought-provoking conversation, spiritual exploration, and authentic connections. The intentional movement has begun, and if you found yourself here, you are a part of it. Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers starts now. Hi, Danny J. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. I'm really honored to have you join me today and talk about everything about the stories we tell ourselves, because you have a story.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. And I love talking about this. I love talking about story and rewriting stories for sure.
Well, I think it's so important because the way we grow up, we are fed a story, and part of that's from, the people around us, and part of it is just from what we pick up on and we tell ourselves, and we build the story of who we are. But then we get to a point, or at least what I've experienced, we get to a point where we start to question that story, that narrative, or who we are. And it shapes so much of our reality. So I think really trying to understand the truth, and I know there's always like the truth, there's like your side, there's another person's side, and then there's the truth. It's always, what is the truth? But coming within and trying to figure out like who we are on an authentic level is really a process of looking at the stories we've told ourselves through our whole life. So let's start with yours, because at 13, you were like a bomb was dropped on you, and what you thought your life was totally different, which I can only imagine rocked your world.
Yeah, for sure. So basically what happened was my full name is Danielle, and my dad's name is Daniel. And the story is my dad says I was named after him, but my mom would always say I was named after Danielle Steele. And I don't know if you remember, but she was an author, and she was in a lot of books that I remember in the grocery store growing up. And they were kind of adult books, it seemed like, right? And when I was 13, I decided to read a Danielle Steele book because I thought, well, I should read one of these books because this is who I'm named after. And the book I picked up was a story of 4 couples who are trying to have children. And they were each going through like infertility struggles or just different things that were happening. And a very high level conversation for a 13-year-old to read. But anyway, I read a lot of really like big books when I was young. So we're driving to gymnastics, and I was kind of telling my dad about this book and in just like an offhanded way. And he just goes, "I'm not your real dad, right?" Like out of nowhere. And I was like, wait, what? And I remember just this feeling in my body, like this flush and red, and I felt sick. And my instant thought was, well, I'm not adopted, because I was racing through my head, picturing photos of my mom pregnant, and there were pictures of me basically like coming out of her. So that was my only thought. Later on as an adult, I'm like, oh, there could have been an affair or something else, but those were not even things I thought of. But he said, well, your mom and I, we couldn't have kids, and we used artificial insemination. Now, I had just read this book, so now I knew what artificial insemination was. And I guess maybe that's why he decided to tell me. I'm not really sure. And I've asked him later why, and it's a whole other story. But he said, yeah, we used artificial insemination. And I was just like, well, who was it? And he said, well, we don't know. And then he dropped me off at gymnastics. And like, that was it. Like, dropped me the bomb. I'm not your dad, kicked me out of the car, and I go to practice, right? And so he picks me. I know it's ridiculous now. And I'm like, holy shit, what were you thinking to tell your daughter this? And then just like leave it at that, as if it's just, as if it's just like, oh, by the way, like I'm going to, send you to school with some extra socks or something, just very casual. Just casually let you know I'm not your dad, and bye. So he picks me up. We don't talk about it. And And I cannot sleep that night. So I finally just get out of bed, probably midnight, and I run to my parents' room and I start shaking my mom. And I'm like, Mom, is dad my real dad? And she's like, what? I go, he told me in the car he's not my dad. And she just says, go to your room. And that's this instant like, oh, I'm in trouble. And what's also thinking back now is like, he didn't even tell my mom he told me. What the hell was that about? So she comes to my room, seems like hours later, probably 20 minutes later. And she says, yes, this is true. She goes, well, he could be because we weren't using protection. But, you know, the story is he got mumps or measles when he was 12 years old and became sterile. And so they couldn't have children. And so they used artificial insemination, an anonymous donor to have me. So then my next question is, well, what about my brother? She goes, well, you know, probably him too. And so I don't think I knew in the moment whether I thought my brother was my full brother or they used a different donor, but I just knew that everything I thought about myself, all of the, you know, ideas of who I was and who my family was gone in an instant. And then she says, well, we don't want to tell him, my brother, and basically just to keep this a secret. And then I was like, well, who's the donor? She said, we don't know. It was anonymous. And so I was left with that at 13 years old to just process and not have anyone to talk about. So of course I created a lot of stories about who I was and what happened. Right. And I remember it was summer vacation. So I was home alone and just sitting on my bathroom counter and like having those mirrors, I don't know, I'd open up the mirror so you could see like layers of yourself. And I just sat in the mirror and just stared. And I'm like, who do I look like? Because I remember I had a cousin on my dad's side. I grew up always telling people, I'm like, I don't really look like my mom or dad. I have blonde hair. My dad has brown. My mom has red. And so I remember doing some genetic stuff in first grade and hearing that like brown hair was a dominant trait. And I was wondering why I didn't have dark brown hair like my dad did. And I just thought it was like, they would tell me, oh, your dad was blonde when he was a little boy. So like, you'll probably your hair will get darker. And so that was the explanation. And I thought I only looked like one cousin on my dad's side. And so then I'm like, well, I don't even look like him because we're not even related. And then I started thinking, well, who could this donor be? And so the story I told myself was, of course, this 13-year-old brain, but I was like, well, who would be donating sperm? Someone who needs money. And who would need money? A drug addict, of course, because they need money to like shoot up and buy drugs. So now my thought is my biological dad, who is half my DNA, is a drug addict junkie who like lives in a park or under a bridge. And so this created this completely different identity of who I was. Now I'm like, I'm disgusting and we're not allowed to talk about this. My mom said, we're not talking about it. So it's like this shameful secret of like, you're here. My dad's a fucking drug addict. And I just felt this horrible disgust about how I got here and who I was and where I came from. And this spiraled me into a massive depression. And when I look back, and I've had a lot of issues with depression over my life, when I look back, I'm like, that was actually the trigger. That was the trigger of my first depressive episode. And it just led into these stories about who I was. And then this led into me like, you know, acting out as a teenager and cutting and getting pregnant in high school. And ultimately, like to wrap up the story, when I was 26 years old, I found out I had a blood disorder, a blood disorder that's hereditary. And so I had to take a DNA test to confirm before I could get treatment. So I confirmed the DNA test. And then my thought, and I had kind of put it out of my head, right? Like who this donor was. And then I thought, well, what else could I have? Like, I don't know who this is. And my grandfather had died of cancer. I'm like, what if on my dad's side I have cancer? And so I ended up taking another DNA test, 23andMe, because 23andMe at the time had a lot of, shared a lot of health stuff. Luckily, I found out I didn't find anything extra there. But about 4 years later, I logged into 23andMe and I was matched with it said I had 2 half sisters. And that was the next big shock of my life because I grew up with one brother, never had sisters. Yeah. And my instant thought was like, oh, these must be the donor's daughters. And I don't even know if they know about me. Because in my mind, I was the only person in the world who was from a donor. So I reached out to these girls fully assuming they're his daughters. And they responded back and they're like, we're from a donor too. And that was another like head explosion, like, wait a second, there's more of us. And turns into this whole thing where we ended up connecting and finding him. And of course, he wasn't a drug addict. And there was a whole lot of shifts. And this all comes down to like the story I told myself really shaped the rest of my life. Turns out the story wasn't even true. Like what you said, there's what happened and like the truth. And that truth was a new reality that I had to integrate into my past. And I have a lot of siblings now who find out through DNA tests that they came from a donor. And I say it changes everything and it changes nothing, because it does change everything in your whole past has to be rewritten in your brain, but it also changes nothing because your parents were your parents. You grew up how you grew up. But the reality is it does change everything, because the stories you have are like how we grasp onto the world and how we know ourselves. And what I really come away with is part of our identity. Like we talk about nature, nurture. Yes, nature is a big part of who we are, and nurture is as well. But I think a big part of our identity is the stories we tell ourselves and who we believe about who we are. And that is like this big third piece that I don't think we talk about enough, but also how it can shape our lives and how we can also rewrite that to create a new reality that maybe we want.
Yeah. That belief, I mean, that's a huge part of it. So we can like tell the stories, but it's like, what do we actually like really like embody? What do we believe? I mean, you obviously learned this at such a formative age too, because those preteen years, I mean, there's already so much going on with you. So, and which is really interesting. I had a few friends in high school that actually found out things in a similar way, that their dad wasn't their dad because he wasn't on their birth certificate or something. And they went to get their driver's some little thing. I actually know like 3 or 4 people that have had not donor dads, but found out their dads weren't their dads. And it was like a shock to the system. And some of them are still dealing with it. I know some people even older that found this out later, that they found out from their parents on their parents' deathbed. And it has like rocked their world. Like it is so, and every single one of these people I'm talking about, just like you, had a loving family, had a loving father, had a father figure in their life. It wasn't like they were like, who are my parents? It was just kind of like, well, who am I then? Like there's this whole other part of me that like, I don't know. And, or there's siblings. Yeah. Some of them have siblings in this way. And that is, it's just, I mean, it's so mind blowing, but any of us can be walking around like that. Like, how do we really know? How do you really know, unless we're all taking DNA tests and we're proving that our dad is our dad and our mom is our mom and our siblings are our siblings? I mean, you don't know for sure.
Yeah. No, you don't know. And what's crazy, you said the right thing. It's like, it's not who's my parents, it's who am I? Because you start to, you're like, I just remember sitting in that mirror and I just was asking that, like, who am I? Who do I look like? I just wanted to have a picture and like maybe some identifying information, but I got so much more than that. But it is really interesting. And there was part of me, I remember when my dad told me when I was going through that depression, I was like, I wish I never knew. I wish I had just believed the lie my entire life, because I would have been a lot happier. But at the same time, knowing now, there are questions that were answered because of DNA and because of nature. There are things I do and ways I behave that when I met my biological dad, I'm like, oh my God, that's why. It made so much sense. There were a lot of parts of me that never understood, why do I look different than my parents? Why do I act different? I mean, I have a very different personality than anyone in my family. And when I met my biological dad, I was like, that's it. This guy, like, he did not raise me, but we are very similar, which is wild. And I think that, yeah, part of me thinks I could have lived with the lie my whole life and it would have been better. But then now that I know the truth, it was hard to be in that middle where I knew that half of the truth, but I didn't know who I was still. And so I think it's very hard for someone on the outside, maybe who hasn't gone through it. Some people just go, well, who cares? Your dad was your dad. I'm like, yes. And to your point, the question is like, but who am I though?
Yeah. It's comes to that like liminal space and like trusting the universe and trusting the divine orchestration of your life is kind of like that middle space. Like, yeah, you have this idea. There actually is a different truth. And then you kind of find out, and then you don't even have the answers. And I think that's what's really interesting, even about your story, is the way it was unfolded to you. Like, it's not like your dad was like, I need to have a talk with you. Let's sit down, and have this discussion. It's like you had this book, you started talking about it, like nothing planned. It was just like dropped in, like the universe was like, it's time for you to hear this. Here you go. And it's like your life unfolded and changed, but it took you down a path that, I mean, you're not here today if that doesn't happen like that.
Yeah. I mean, That is part of the question too. I'm like, why didn't you tell? Mom and dad should have sat me down, or maybe they should have known. I should have known from the beginning, right? Like if I knew from day one, and there's something I've really seen from the people who are donor conceived or adopted, who knew from day one, they don't have this traumatic stuff to process. They're just like, oh, it was always, that's how it was. I always knew I was adopted. I always knew I came from this. But to have it dropped on you later on when you formed an identity and you formed stories and you formed beliefs around who you are, that's when it rocks your world. So when I turned 15, I got pregnant, and I ended up having a little girl, and I placed her for adoption. And because of my experience, I remember choosing her adoptive parents, and that was a conversation we had, was I want her to always know. I don't want her to find out when she's 13, like, oh, by the way, we're not your parents. Like, sorry. Yeah. And so we have since reconnected. She's in my life, and actually her name is Courtney. And she's my podcast editor and producer. And, she has a really, I want to say, easy adoption story. She was like, it just always was. I've always knew, and it wasn't a big deal. And it made me feel unique, and it made me feel good, which makes me feel so good that she didn't go through that experience of like having the rug pulled out from under her. And I've seen over the years, as I've met more donor conceived people, that the ones who knew don't have as many issues. So it's just like telling the truth all along. And then that process of knowing who you are is integrated, but it's like the way that it was done. And my poor brother, we kept it a secret. And I finally told my parents about 4.5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago now, hey, I just found out my donor through DNA test, and you need to tell, my brother. And so we sat him down at 33 years old, and my dad told him, not in the way he told me, but told him in the way probably he should have told me. But at 33, it's like, wait a second, what? Like, you've been keeping this a secret for my entire life. So, he had to go through his own process as well. And it is just an interesting thing. And it's just a very extreme example, right? But we have stories like this through all kinds of things. Like maybe if relationships we're in, and somebody is like in love with us, and suddenly they're like, I'm not in love with you anymore, or they're having an affair. And you're like, wait a second, what? Like, my reality was we were together and we were happy, and like you're living in a completely different reality with another partner. So I think this is a very relevant example, even though it's an extreme example that maybe not everyone could relate to the exact story, because they're like, no, Danny, my dad's my dad, my mom's not. Like, I know. But I think we do all have things that come up in our lives where the rug's pulled out, or we thought things were good and they're not. Or maybe, I meet a lot of athletes who their whole world was being an athlete, and then they become injured, and then it's like, well, who am I, and what do I do now? And so I think we all come up with times in our lives where we're confronted with an identity shift, and we have to really figure out who we are and what are those stories, and how we can change those.
Yeah. I mean, it could be anything, like you identify with your career and your job, and COVID happens and it goes away. Okay. Then what do you do? Yeah. All of a sudden you're left with like, okay, I identified as this. So, I mean, moms, we do it all the time. We identify as moms. This is who we are. And then your kids go off, or you find out you want something more. There's so many different parts of our life that we like take on as us. And then, yeah, you're confronted with something that changes, and it's like, okay, now who am I underneath? And that's why I think it's so important to actually truly understand who we are from within, and learn to have a belief system about ourselves of like who we are at the core. So like, how did you finally start to like accept who you were, learn to be who you were, and rewrite your story?
Yeah. I think this has been one of the lessons, maybe the karmic lessons that I've been sent here to learn, because I felt like it happened so many times for me. So it was, your example of like COVID, just similar things where first it was that, right? Who am I in this case? And then I was an acrobat and I got paralyzed, and I'm like, well, if I can't perform, then what good am I? And my degree was in physical education, and I can't walk. So what does that mean for me? And then, I was married, and suddenly I had a betrayal, and it was like, wait, like I thought we were doing this together. And so it's happened. It's like this on repetition. It's like, okay, until you figure this out, Danny, we're going to keep giving you these lessons. And so it was a lot of just inner work. A lot of course, like therapy and talking through and realizing that I couldn't place my identity on attaching it to things outside of myself, right? Because we even as a mom, like I think that's not a dangerous identity, but just to say like, this is who I am and what I do, because what happens when your kids move out and they're gone? And like, now what do you do? I mean, that happens to a lot of moms when it's the empty nest syndrome, right? And that's real. And I think there's parts of us that can feel that grief and that heartbreak. And I think that's a process. And part of it is like learning to grieve who you thought you were, take the lessons from it, forgive yourself for, where you were and maybe believing that. And then realizing there's an inner part that can't be taken away. Like your identity is rooted within like who you are as spirit, not what you do, not who you're married to, not who your parents are. And so for me, it's been a process, and it's been like this universe, like, okay, you didn't get it this time. Let's try again. And I don't know about you, but like, I feel like we all have these lessons that like the universe keeps trying to tell us these lessons, and you're like, all right, okay, I'm finally getting it. Got it.
I mean, isn't that true? Those lessons, they're just going to keep coming, and they're going to come in bigger ways until you finally like accept it. But I mean, wow, that's a lot that you just said that has happened to you. Big things. Tell me about like your acrobatic injury. Mm-hmm. What happened there? I mean, that's a huge life shift too.
Totally. It's funny. My boyfriend, he's always like, you never tell people about when you're paralyzed. I'm like, I know, it's a weird thing.
How do you not tell people?
I was, I know. It's so funny now, because now I'm like, okay, it makes sense. But so of course I said I was a gymnast. And, when I got out of high school, I was coaching gymnastics, and one of my clients was costume designer at Miss Stair in Cirque du Soleil. And she introduced me to some woman and got me kind of into this acrobatic field. And as a gymnast, it's really easy to become an acrobat. Like you don't like learn trapeze and things like that. You just have to have the physical ability, and then they can teach it to you. Right. So I found out about this audition for SeaWorld, and I just graduated college, or I was in my senior year, and my coach told me about this opportunity, and I applied, and I got accepted. So I always say, like, I did what any college graduate would do, and I ran off and joined the circus. Like, got my first degree. My parents are so proud. I'm like, bye, peace out, I'm going to SeaWorld. So, and it was the most, I mean, I can't tell you, like, it was like a dream job, and it was a dream come true. Like, I didn't even know existed, right? When you're little, you're not like, I'm going to grow up and run in the circus. You go to circuses and you just go, I don't know how people got here. Like, you just assume they were born in Russia and like they were born in a circus family. And a lot of them are, and that's the truth. A lot of them are literally Russians that grow up in circus families. But as a little American girl, you could be in the circus too. And so the money was good. Like, you get paid so much as a performer. And so I got to move to San Diego, freaking beautiful. I'm in my 20s. I have this beautiful, like, dream come true life, and I am just living it. And all of a sudden I get out of bed and I like fall out of bed and my legs aren't working. And I was like, of course, thinking maybe I got injured, of course, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. End up going to a doctor. They said, you have sciatica. And I'm like, okay, this is annoying, but I'll get through it. By the end of the next day after leaving the ER, could not walk. I'm screaming in excruciating pain. And I had already gone to the ER. I had a boyfriend in town visiting. He was like a traveling performer. And he was like, I don't know what to do with you. I got to go. I'm going to send you to your parents. So he got me on a flight to Vegas from San Diego. And I had to get in a wheelchair. My mom picked me up from the hospital, or from the airport, goes straight to the hospital in Vegas. They get me in. I have like 104-degree fever. They're like, this isn't sciatica with a fever like this. And a couple days later, found out I have this bacterial infection that could have killed me, but it lodged in my sacroiliac joint and made me paralyzed instead. And so I remember the doctor came in, because I literally was like, I got to get out of here. I've got a show on Saturday. And they're like, no, you're not getting out of here. And my doctor, I remember, she just says, you're not going to perform again. We're not sure if you're going to walk again, and you're lucky to be alive. And I think she was saying this to me to like really get me into like, see how serious it was. But I was like, no, I got to go. I got to call my boss. I got to be there Saturday. Like, it still wasn't sinking into me. And she's like, you have a very serious like thing, and this could have killed you. And like, you're lucky that you're in pain, because otherwise you wouldn't have had any other symptoms and you could have died like you could have been dead by today. And so I don't think I understood the severity until years later, like, oh, that could have killed me. However, I thought as soon as the bacteria was gone, I'd be able to walk, and it took a long time. And I remember, I ended up getting out of the hospital. I had to move back to my parents. I was sleeping downstairs on the couch because I couldn't climb up the stairs. And I just remember thinking, I wish it did kill me because this is miserable. And if I can't walk, if I'm going to be a handicapped person, I'd rather be dead. And my big shift there was one of my dear, dear friends was 18 years old and she just got diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And she came to visit me after I had gotten out of the hospital, and I was starting to use a walker. I had one leg, my right leg could move a little bit. So I could like lean on the walker, move my right leg, and then just like drag my left leg. So I had opened the door when she came to see me. I was in the walker, opened the door, and she just stood there and she was like, Danny, I am so sorry. I can't believe this happened to you. It's so unfair. And she said, it's so unfair. And I just remember getting this pit in my stomach, like, Kelly has cancer. She's going to die. And she's saying it's unfair that I can't walk. And after she left, I was like, damn, I got to get my act together, and I had done all this like personal development and listened to all these tapes. And so I was like, okay, where do I start? Like gratitude practice. So I started just with this silly gratitude practice. Like, okay, instead of being upset that I can't walk, I at least should be grateful that I'm going to live. And instead of being upset that I live with my parents, at least I'm grateful I have somewhere to go. And so it started there. And I, within a year, I was able to walk again, like without a noticeable limp or anything like that. And within a year, Kelly passed away. And so I really like give credit to her. Like that moment was the moment of me getting out of my pity party and going, wait a second, this is not okay. And I also shifted my mindset too. And I think this was important, that even if I did stay in a walker my whole life, even if I was not able to walk again, I still was trying to find possibilities and ways that I could like make it work, because I realized that was really a second chance at life, or another, maybe a third chance or fourth chance at life. But it was something that I had to shift. And back to like writing the story of like, I had to get out of, I wasn't an acrobat and I'm not a performer and maybe I'm not a gymnast. And like, those were identities I really hung on to. And so I had to turn that around and go, okay, who am I without movement, without being able to do stuff? Like my friends don't just love me because I can walk or because I can do flips. My friends like me because of what are these things. And so that was actually a big piece of me trying to figure out who I was what do my friends hang out with me for? Is it because my body? Is it because what I can do? And it's like, no, it's how you make people feel. It's, sense of humor. It's like how you show up in the world, how you care about people. And so I think if you're, kind of maybe feeling this way too about like some kind of part of your personality or part of your identity has been shifted, is thinking about why do people love you and what are they there for? And is it because of your money or your stuff or what you do? And if the answer is yes, then you probably need new friends. But if you're being honest with yourself, the answer is no. Your people around you, the people who really love you and support you, aren't with you because of that stuff.
That's a hard one to accept, I think, because I think that needs to start with us liking ourselves and seeing the good in ourselves. And your friend, I mean, obviously an angel, to give you that lesson in a way, and how heartbreaking that is. But it took going within. And I'm just even thinking about what you're saying is like, it is how we make people feel. But so many of us, I feel, don't even like ourselves or don't see the good in ourselves. So it's hard for us to say, this is why this person likes me. If we can't see it for ourselves, how do we acknowledge that someone may like us for something other than our money, our looks, our body, what we do for them?
Yeah. I don't think so. After I was paralyzed, I ended up getting in the fitness industry, partially because I think when you're paralyzed, the only thing you want to do is walk. And so I was like, when I can walk again, I'm going to run. Like I started doing marathons and just extreme fitness. And I worked with a lot of people with eating disorders and body image stuff. And, you know, there's this talk of like self-love and like, how do you love yourself if you hate yourself? Like, how do you love your body if you really hate your body? And I would share this, that you don't necessarily have to start with self-love. I kind of joked on this one podcast. I was like, sometimes you just have to start with self-meh. Like, all right, I don't hate it myself, but I don't love myself either, because that's fine. Sometimes we just have to get to neutrality. I think, especially if you've had any kind of self-hatred or low self-esteem for a long time, you cannot go from like hating yourself, hating your thighs, hating your body to like, now I love myself. Like, that's a huge jump. You have to get to a place where you're just like, all right, well, I like my knees. Like, they're not the worst. And like my feet are okay. Like, I hate my face. I hate my stomach. I hate my butt. Like, I've hated every part of my body. And then I've had to look and just find like, all right, well, my ears are fine. Like, not every part of me is the worst. So I think it comes to like starting with neutrality, like self-myth, and moving from there. And you have to know your friends, even if you don't see it, even if your friends are like, I think you're so fantastic. And you're like, I'm not, but they're probably not lying. So you got to like believe them, and you don't have to believe it about yourself. But I think it starts with like just getting to a place of neutrality. I don't think we could jump straight from hate to love.
I love the self-meh. That is, and I've talked to DJ Eidson of Limitless Minds on the show, and we've talked about the whole concept of neutrality and the neutral mindset. So I think you are right on there with your mindset and your mindset shifts, getting to that neutral space. That like self-meh is going to be my like new mantra. I mean, how perfect is that? I mean, because it's true. Anything mindset shift, any big shift you're trying to make in your life. Let's say it's like people talk about manifestation all the time. Let's say you're like wanting to manifest your multi-million-dollar home and all these great things. And then, you know, all the manifesting coaches out there say, well, you have to believe it and embrace it and be that energy and embody it. But you're like, yeah, I have negative 10 in my bank account. How am I embodying that $100 million mansion? Like, there has to be some middle ground. You got to like your knees in there somewhere, you know, like you got to come somewhere.
Totally. So, totally. I know. I'm like thinking like, see these self-love accounts and like a t-shirt. I should just have a t-shirt that's like self-meh. Like, oh my goodness. But it's so true. And I think too, like the manifestation thing, and I've been in personal development a long time, and there's a lot of parts of manifestation work that I find really cringy. And it's like, it's not quite there, because you can't go from hate to love. You can't go from like extreme, lack to abundance. Like your mind just can't make that jump, and there has to be a middle. There has to be like just a baby step up. Like, okay, I want to believe I could be a millionaire, but right now I need to believe I could get $20 in my bank account, right? Like, and I've seen all these things like write a check to the universe. How many checks have I written to, like $1 million checks I've written to the universe, and I ain't never had that in my bank account yet, because there's no way I can believe that shit. It's just ridiculous. So we really have to like, and it's not as sexy. Like nobody wants to hear you got to just like your knees, right? Like that's not, but like you got to start somewhere, because honestly, because the truth is what's really hard is there's people like me, and I'll say Gabby Bernstein, because she was the one that triggered me at first. She, if you don't know who she is, who's listening, she's an author. She's a very skinny blonde woman in New York, very successful. And she's a manifestation, you know, she's written a lot of books. And she was like talking about how like, in order for you have to love your body first. And I was like, easy for you to say, you're already skinny, you're already beautiful, right? And at this point, I had like gained 30 pounds over this time. And I was just like, how can I love my body? Like my body is betraying me. I'm gaining weight. I'm doing all the right things. Yeah. And so I remember just being pissed hearing her. I'm like, screw you. So easy for you to say skinny bitch. But then I was like, wait a second. Maybe she didn't always look that way. And so it's like, maybe I do have to start there. Maybe I do have to love myself as I am now in order to get to where I want to be. And this is really tricky, because where our mind goes is like, well, let's just say I'm, 50 pounds overweight. If I love myself 50 pounds overweight, then why would I have incentive to get skinny or lose the weight? So like, we kind of feel like we have to hate ourselves into where we want to be. But unfortunately, sometimes there is something that we can't change. Let's say like a lot of women have stretch marks from pregnancy or like really loose skin. Like I've seen a lot of stomachs who are unfortunately like kind of destroyed after a baby. And that's like, I want to love myself, but I can't like, and I can't change the skin. Like the skin is not going to change unless you have surgery. Right. So you do have to find a place where you're like, okay, I don't hate it. Like I could have surgery. It's fine, but I'm not going to like obsess over this skin every day because there's nothing I could do about it. So there are real things, and it's hard for someone who's like on their soapbox, like someone like me who are like, okay, Danny, good, easy for you to say. You don't have that problem that I have. That's what I was thinking when I'm looking at Gabby, like easy for you to say you are already skinny, easy for you to say you're already pretty. So it's hard sometimes. And I'm really careful about my privilege and where I'm at to say those kind of things because I'm not in everyone's shoes. I don't have a bunch of loose skin from pregnancy, or I don't have black skin, and I wasn't like I didn't have issues because of my race. So there's certain things that I don't relate to. So I do have to say, like, you may have something you really can't change, and that does suck for you, but you do have to get to a place of acceptance and going, this is what it is. And instead of hating it, we're going to learn to just be friends with it, at least because we're living together. We're on each other's body. We're in each other's, we're in each other's space. So instead of like hating that part of you that you can't get rid of, like you can't cut your arm off or whatever, just going, we're going to learn to be together. I don't have to love you yet, but I'm going to just be like, you're here. I'm here. We're doing this together. And like, there's got to be a level of acceptance. So if it starts with meh, like, I don't care about you, fine. But that's a huge, that's life changing when you go from hating something and obsessing and always thinking about it to just not caring. That is so much mental space that you have now that you can like do good things with and go on with your life. Because I remember obsessing about my body, and man, there's a lot of wasted years. There's a lot of things I could have done. There's a lot of lives I could have changed. There's a lot of things I could have done. Instead, I was worried about what the scale said every day and like pinches on my body and stupid things that really didn't matter in the big picture. But we get hyper focused on that. And if we could just get to a place of, all right, let's exist together. Like you're on me, like I got this thing, whatever your supposed thing is, and learning to live with it so you can do what you're meant to do in the world and like create things and like change people's lives. But I think us wasting time on those things that we can't change is really just, I don't know, it's just a way for us to spiral out and not show up in the world in a better way. And we're not here to serve when we're just constantly focusing on that.
Well, all this hyper focus is usually on stuff outside of us. I mean, it comes back to the same thing. It's all on this outside thing. Even comparing yourself, like Gabby Bernstein, look at you, like it's easy for you to say, we don't know what's going on within her. She has her own challenges. Everyone does. And so we focus so much outside of us, and saying the hyper focus is on like how we look or how much money we make, how we identify ourselves. There's just so much on that. And that's why I think it's so important. And that's why it's one of my missions is to like come back to understand who we are within and do something better with our lives to contribute in a way with creatively, whether it's like with your children or a podcast or a book, whatever, like serving in some sort of way. I mean, I think that is a word that you just used, and one that I've talked about a lot. And I feel like I've learned a ton about in the last year is this whole concept of being in service. Like, what else are we here for?
I love that. I was just at a retreat this month, and we were talking about work. And if you can shift your mindset from working as service, it just brings a completely different energy to everything. And, if you're able to serve, and maybe if you're even like this feeling of like, I have to work or I'm not going to make money or whatever, it's all about our energy we bring to things. Yeah. We can, even back to the weight loss story, you can lose weight by hating yourself through the whole process, or you can lose weight by loving yourself in the process. Loving yourself doesn't keep you from getting to your goals, but it's going to make the ride a little more enjoyable. And also, if you think that by the time you get to that goal weight, you're going to suddenly love yourself, you're wrong, because there's a lot of wiring that you've done in your brain. So you're going to find something else to dislike, or you're going to be like, oh, it's still not good enough. Right. Or like I've had clients who lost a lot of weight, lost 100 pounds, and then they got the loose skin because they lost so much weight. It's like, well, now I hate the skin. I'm like, well, but you're 100 pounds less. So what is it going to be? Do you want to be fat with the skin fine, or you want to be skinny with the loose skin? Like, you got to find ways to love yourself regardless. So it's like, what kind of energy do we want to be in? So we can have struggle through the reaching the goals, or we can have ease with reaching the goals. But ultimately, we got to decide how we want to live this life. It's going to be hard, or it's going to be fun.
But even with the whole concept of like, when is it good enough? I'm just bringing all these conversations I'm having together into one place right now. And I've been talking to a lot of people that have been in the beauty industry or fashion industry, like modeling, things like that. And even them, they didn't feel good enough. They were like the top of their game. People that, you look up to, you look in magazines as little girls, like, I want to look like that. That's beautiful. That is absolute perfection. And they're still not good enough. Like, so what is good enough? It comes back, it kind of coincides with that, that meh attitude, like we have to find that just like acceptance.
Yeah. I mean, there's never good enough if it's not good enough, right? Like, you have to decide what's enough for you. And at some point, I think we all kind of that, like, the universe lessons that try to knock you over the head. I think a lot of people's lesson is enough, figuring out what's enough. And usually that comes from something in childhood. Like, I was never good enough for my dad or my mom. And I'm still trying to get that affirmation from whoever. And so they're acting out these childhood wounds that turns into adulthood, where they're still trying to get success or affirmation. And ultimately, it's never enough, right? Because there could always be more. You could always have more zeros in your bank account. There's always somebody doing better than you, or who's prettier than you, or who's younger than you, or who's skinnier than you, or who's more talented than you. Even our best athletes, they are at a peak for a short time, right? Like, there's going to be another Michael Phelps someday who's better than him. He's maybe at the top. Even Michael Jordan, there might be another athlete. So there's always going to be somebody who can exceed what you've done. And so you have to decide what's good enough for you and how much is enough. And ultimately, that comes back to doing the inner work, working through your own childhood traumas, inner child work, or whatever you're doing, and going, okay, I realize why it's not enough. Like, okay, I see that what I'm doing, why I feel like I'm not enough, is because I never got that affirmation from my mom, or I never got that affirmation from my dad. And either having those conversations or just giving yourself the affirmation now. Like, yeah, Danny, you're good enough now. It's okay. I'm going to let you off the hook. And you can strive, and you can have big goals, and you can keep going, but you're doing it out of a place of, I'm excited to see my potential. Not I'm doing it out of a place of, I'm trying to run from something, or I'm trying to gain affirmation for something. I think I was listening to Grant Cardone again. I've listened to this over and over, and I get something different from different places I'm in, but his book, Be Obsessed or Be Average. And he said he was in this room. He was doing sales training to this group of top leaders, and they were all like 7-figure earners. The average earner was like made $980,000. So they're like all millionaires, and they're like, yeah, we're bosses. We're making $1 million. He's like, what's that have to do with your potential? You're cool in front of your crew, but there's people making 10 million, 20 million, whatever. But it's like, I loved this idea of, how about instead of reaching because it's not enough, but just how about we just go to see how far we can go, or what we like. We're doing it because we want to see if we can push ourselves more. It doesn't mean money. Maybe it's just like being the best mom, being the best partner, but finding those things that light you up, and you're being driven because you want to see how much you can be better, not to beat someone else or to run from like your past or trying to prove something. I was definitely a prover, because I was pregnant in high school, I really wanted to prove to people that I wasn't a statistic. So I did a lot of things out of that prove it energy of like, I'm not going to be that. I can be successful. I'm not going to be a welfare mom, that kind of thing. And so ultimately, I think we got to look at our motivations of why we do things, and really come to terms with, what those are.
Yeah. It's almost like that prove it statement. I have that. My husband has that. Definitely a lot of times we embark on that. You want to prove someone or something wrong about you. And that comes back to your stories, like whatever story you were told, and it all circles back to your childhood, like it or not, it all does. Whether it was stuff imprinted on you on purpose or subconsciously, it doesn't really matter. It all stems back from those really formative years. No pressure, parents. I always say this. I have 2 little ones. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And every time I'm talking like this, I'm like, oh, geez, how am I messing them up today? But I mean, this stuff happens so much to change and like impact the way we go about our life, whether we mean it to or not, and the way we tell our stories, and just our whole energy we bring to our existence, essentially.
Yeah. I think it's so crazy because I'm in my 40s now, and I just think about how literally everything that I deal with now is like from before the age of 18. And I'm like, dang, for the first 20 years, mess you all up. And then you're dealing with it for the next 20. But then I'm also thinking about my friends with kids and raising them. And I go, but it's our job to fuck up our kids. Like, otherwise they're not going to be fun. They're not going to be cool. Like, they got to have some. So my daughter, she's amazing. And I told her, I said, I placed you for adoption, not because I wanted you to have a perfect life. I wanted you to have a better life, but not a perfect life. And her parents got divorced. And I was like, good. You need a little bit of that stuff to work through. So that makes you it makes you adaptable. It makes you resilient. It gives you some personality. I met a guy a couple years back, and he was like, man, he felt actually stuck because he had such a perfect life. He was like, I didn't have anything hard happen to me. I'd never experienced any kind of hardship. And he felt stunted by that. And so honestly, like, we worry so much about messing up our kids, but like, you got to mess them up a little bit. Like, because it gives personality, it makes them relatable, and it also teaches them resilience. So like, for all you parents, like, just mess them up a little bit. It's fine.
You got to give them something to talk about on a podcast 20 years from now, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's like, this is what gives people good stories and resilience. And the lessons, and unfortunately, some people don't take the lessons, right? They go down the path of, I could have gone down the path of destruction and turned into a drug addict and made my life completely different. But if you give them enough values and sense of who they are, like, even that stuff that mess up, eventually they'll come out of it. And I think we have to have faith in humans that they'll be able to, like, be triumphant. But yeah, it's freaking hard to be a parent because it really does matter. Those first few years are really big.
And they're hard. They are hard.
They are. My brother has 6 kids, and
oh my goodness.
So I'm an auntie to these ones, and like, I look at all of them and I could see, I'm like, oh, this one's going to have some issues in high school, and this one's like, so like, but it's like, you're doing the best you can, and they're all on their own journeys, and they're going to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. How do we follow you, listen to your podcast, work with you, learn from you, all the good stuff?
Yeah. So the best place to, like, find me is on Instagram. That's where I spend the most time. And so it's DannyJ.com. It's DANNY like a boy, and then the letter J, and then I spell out .com, DOTCOM. You can find me up. My website is DannyJ.com, and my podcast is called The Best Life Podcast. And we're about 50 episodes in. My partner, Jill Coleman, she's my best friend. We do so much on personal development, communication, relationships, a lot of these, like, deep conversations. So if you like this, I think you'll really love The Best Life. And you can find that wherever you listen. If you're listening to the show right now, you can find it wherever you're listening here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of your stories with us, all your very real and amazing stories.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
And that's it for today's Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Danny J, for joining me in such a beautiful and open conversation about the stories that we tell ourselves, how we grow up, and how we incorporate them into our lives moving forward. And also how we can change our mindset and make those shifts to live differently and accept everything about ourselves. If you want to get in touch with Danny or follow along in her journey, I'll put all the information of how to do so in the show notes below. And as always, you can find Intentional Media and Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers on our website at CourtneyMyers.com. That's where you'll find books, courses, and everything else we have going on. So stay tuned, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.